That's it. Non-duality barking out there. Good a place to start as any. Anyway, welcome. It's nice to be back in Munich, or near Munich. So I'll talk for a little while, and then we'll see what happens. I don't think anybody in here is new to this, are they? Everyone's... Well, anyway, I'll still talk for a little while, and we'll see where it gets us. So, non-duality. I'm hesitating because as soon as I say that word, the impossibility of saying anything that really makes sense is the next thought that kind of comes into what could be called a mind. But we'll face that impossibility anyway, so I'm going to start with the impossible sentence that seeing non-duality, the heart of it is, as I said last night, if you were here then, is seeing that there is no self. And in a way, that's the beginning and the middle and the end of it. If we are seekers, or if we have been seekers, I was certainly a seeker, there can sound like there are many deep mysteries when we start looking into, well, however we see it, the transpersonal, the spiritual, the non-dual, or any particular path. It may seem, may not, but it may seem there are many mysteries, many complex and convoluted philosophical ideas to gather and to grapple with and to struggle to understand, and in a way all of that can just be swept away in even a split second of seeing. I mean, I use this phrase over and over again, even a split second of seeing. I use it only because that is sometimes what happens. It's quite frequently what happens. It's by no means the only way that the seeing of non-duality can happen. As I was saying last night, we're talking about complete freedom here, so as soon as somebody in the seat at the front of the room sounds like they're laying down some kind of rules, like it has to be like this, whether it has to be experienced like this, or you have to do such and such in order to experience it, that's probably a good time to get up out of the chair and leave the room, because that alone, is reason to be suspicious, because, this is freedom here. This is not a path, because a path, almost by definition, has to have rules. In a way, a path has a boundary. How do we know a path is a path? Because it has a boundary. If we see a path across a field, how do we know it's a path? Because it's not the field. It has boundaries which cut it off from the field. And, boundaries are kind of rules. I don't know about here in Germany, but in some fields in England, if you step over the boundary off the path, I'm exaggerating, a farmer is not going to shoot you, but a farmer might shout at you, they really might shout at you. So there's sort of rules there. So we can't talk really, as far as I'm concerned, about, as soon as we talk about path, we're talking about rules. As soon as we start laying down experiences, it has to be like this, we're talking about rules, so just forget about all of this, that. As I was saying last night, this is just absolute freedom. However, having said that, I go back to the sentence as I just spoke, that sometimes, often enough for it to be worth commenting on maybe, the way this is first seen, apprehended, I don't like the word experience, but we could use that experience, is it could just be literally a momentary seeing that there is no self. So that's as good, if we're going to say that there is anything at the heart of this, then that's as good a statement to make as any. That we're talking about the possibility of seeing that the sense that we have probably lived with all our conscious lives, that I am a separate entity with something which is sometimes called a self, which is often called a self. I am a person who is separate in my identity with all that implies. What we're talking about here is often, it's just the sudden seeing through that. It's just the sudden seeing that this assumption I've made all my life, that my whole life has been founded on, in a way, that everything important in my life is kind of founded on, in a way, that it's just, I don't know, fairy dust. Less than fairy dust. It's simply a kind of illusion. Using the word illusion quite carefully to mean what it hopefully will say that it means in a decent dictionary, something that is different to how it appears to be. So it appears for most of us that there is separation, that there is a separate self with all that implies. I'll talk maybe a little bit about what that implies in a minute or two. It appears that that is the case, and one split second of that dropping away can reveal that it's an illusion, in the sense that what's actually going on or seems to be happening is quite different to what we have assumed up to that point. And it's so different that even that sentence, that we have assumed up to that point, suddenly loses its meaning, because it's suddenly seen that there is no we. So if I say, up to the point of seeing through the self, I have assumed that I am in control of my life, that very sentence kind of collapses and loses its meaning. It doesn't make sense anymore when it's seen, well, there is no I who could possibly have had something called a life, which I could possibly have been in control of, or even out of control. I mean, as an I, as a me, I might feel out of control of my life. That's equally kind of revealed to be, in a way, nonsense. There is no I, there is no one, therefore, who can own a life. There is, therefore, no one who can be in control of their life or out of control of their life. And this, just listen to people talking about this, read people talking about this. It's quite obvious that this can be a tremendous shock. I mean, a tremendous shock is a huge understatement. There aren't really any words that can describe what this can be. When it's suddenly seen like this, it's not always seen suddenly, and if it's not seen suddenly, it may be less of a shock. And then there are rare, I would imagine, rare beings for whom the sense of being a separate self never really kind of coagulated out of everything in the first place. So for them too, it will not be a shock, what I'm talking about, but for many of us it is. Because this experience of being an I, of being a separate person, carries with it such huge assumptions and such huge stories, which in a way are obvious, but nevertheless the fact that they're obvious is not going to stop me talking about them for a little while. So, I mean, the first thing is, if I am a me, if I am a separate entity moving through this external stuff called the world, and negotiating with it, so I have this life, well, one of the first things that goes with that, fairly obviously, is responsibility. If I'm a separate entity and I have this thing called a life, then it's not a very big step for me to start thinking that I'm responsible for that life. It is up to me and my actions to determine how that life goes, and whether it goes well or badly, whatever those terms may mean. And whatever they mean will depend on the culture I seem to have been born into and the conditionings I've been subject to, in a way. But that's kind of one of the first things that goes with this sense of an I, is, I'm responsible. And it's pretty clear that going along with that is almost certainly going to be some kind of, this is also very fundamental, some kind of moral schema. There's good and bad and right and wrong. There's good ways in which I can exert my responsibility to live my life, and there's bad ways. And that's also going to be dependent on my circumstances and conditioning. You know. So I've got responsibility, and I've got morality, I've got good and bad and right and wrong, and I am negotiating a path through time. It doesn't have to be a spiritual path, obviously, but you know, I have a beginning and time is flowing. My life unfolds along this path of time, and I am negotiating with lots of other people and with circumstances to hopefully make my life go as well as possible, whatever that might be. I mean, if I'm born into a family of thieves and robbers, then a life lived well will be a life that results in the most successful robberies, I suppose. If I, you know. I've paused because a little joke just came into my mind and I had to stop, so I thought it probably won't work in German, unfortunately. Do you have barristers in, you know, advocates at law? Do you call them barristers?
Yeah.
Yeah? No. No, it's not going to work then. And do you have baristas in coffee bars?
Yeah.
No, it works in English, you see. Whether you see, it depends on what family you're born into, whether you end up as a barrister or a barista. Anyway, thank you for humouring me as I laboured through that joke in the wrong language. But, you know, you get the point. You know, there's an awful lot of baggage that attaches to this one central perception that there is something solid in here called my identity, however you want to describe it, called my identity. And I use the word perception there deliberately because what I'm suggesting is that if that drops away, even for a second, or a split second, then it can start to be seen, or it can be seen, it can start to be acknowledged, that this sense of identity in here, with everything that it carries, which seems so central to my being, my identity, my purpose in life, is actually just another perception, like all the other perceptions that arise. No more important, no less important either. You know, perception. There's a feeling of weight in my hand suddenly that wasn't there anymore before. You know, perception. I take a drink. A taste of beautiful unique tap water or mineral water. Lovely. The heaviness of a glass in my hand. I mean, perceptions. I mean, unless we are long-term students of phenomenology, which I hope we're not, I mean, I certainly am not, you know, we're not going to make a huge deal out of that perception. I mean, if I've been reading Heidegger for the last 5 years, I could probably now write a university doctoral thesis on the weight of this glass in my hand and how it's perceived. But most of the time, thank goodness we don't do that. You know, it's just a perception. It has no importance. It might be pleasurable, neutral, or not pleasurable. Don't give it any importance. My suggestion is that the sense that seems to be so central and important, that I have this very important thing called a life and I'm responsible for it and I make decisions about it and it goes well or badly and I do right or wrong in the world. So important. All the stories that go with that, the morality stories, the religious stories, the philosophical, the psychotherapeutic, the psychological stories, so much hangs of this, and what I'm suggesting is it's just another perception. It's no more and no less important than the feel of the weight of the glass of water in my hand. Certainly it may be experienced as a great deal more important, but my suggestion is it isn't. And that this accounts for the descriptions that we may read or we may listen to of the shock that often goes when this is suddenly seen through. So it's just popped into my head. Naomi Wolf wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine, didn't she? And this is kind of like the real shock doctrine. You know, never mind what my own wolf thinks. I mean, not, you know, she's okay. But this is the real shock. It's just seeing that everything that made sense to me up to that point, everything I built, listen to the words, you know, everything I built my life on up to the point of it dropping away, just meaningless. Not right, not wrong, not good, not bad, but meaningless. And I have to say, not right, not wrong, not good, not bad, because I'm using the word meaningless, and usually that carries a lot of baggage, that word. I mean, for the average, you know, kind of the person, in inverted commas, who has an average experience of life, I mean, the word meaningless is not usually a good word. Meaningless, well, that sounds a bit kind of dour and depressing and existentially bleak and so on. No, I don't mean any of that. In fact, in a way, I'm going to suggest that it can be the opposite. It doesn't have to be. That to see, I mean, you know, in Western philosophy, you say life is meaningless, and the expectation is we're about to read a very depressing treatise. You know, extremely depressing, which, you know, at the end of us may, you know, lead us into a state of near existential near suicide, from which we might draw back at the very end at the realisation that maybe it's worth going on because we might enjoy our supper tonight. But it's pretty bleak usually the way that word's interpreted in the West, meaningless. Well, I don't mean it that way. I'm offering it to you as a word to celebrate and a celebration. You know, I'm suggesting to you that, you know, a sense of meaning, in a way, that can often be the heavy one. Oh God, you know, getting through life, supporting a sense of meaning and living in accordance with all that goes with that, which is often a very strict morality. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. That can actually be the thing that really drags us down. I'm suggesting to you that, you know, to say that this is revealed as meaningless it's an absolute delight. It's meaningless, so it can be enjoyed. You know, we don't have, oh God, we don't have to suffer from it and serve God because it's meaningless. Isn't that wonderful? But from the perspective of the one who feels separate, it may well be impossible to hear it like that. And I have a very poor memory, and I don't think it happened last night in the talk. I can't remember. It definitely happened the last talk I gave on Saturday. I had to spend quite a lot of time defending myself against the charge of nihilism from someone in the audience. It was his first time, and, you know, there was this talk about meaninglessness, and of course then you get the response, oh, this is nihilistic. No, it's not nihilistic. You know, I mean, I'm a very amateur philosopher, and I'm not even a good amateur philosopher, but nevertheless my understanding of the word nihilism, you know, what I'm saying of nihilism is that it posits that there is a person, but there is no meaning in life. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there is no person. Therefore, there's no meaning in life, if you like, but the central thing is there's no person. It's a million miles away from nihilism, you know. And again, it seems to me that at least in kind of romantic philosophical literature, nihilism kind of is an arrow pointing straight towards suicide, whereas non-duality, to me, is an arrow pointing straight towards freedom. So there's nothing nihilistic about what I'm saying as far as this is concerned, anyway. So that's the suggestion from here. This is about freedom. It's about freedom from the burden of being a person, you know, with the weight of the past attached to us. All those mistakes I made as a person in the past, and the guilt and remorse about that, if there is that. It doesn't have to be. And the burden of the future to which I am moving and for which I am responsible for. I am responsible for ensuring that the future is a good one, and if it's a bad one, then that's my responsibility. That heavy weight, I'm just suggesting that all of that just fall away when it's seen that there's no person for it to attach to. It doesn't make sense anymore. It's like the person is the foundation stone on which all of this other stuff to do with a person's life is based. I've often said before, you know, that we don't need to demolish the person stone by stone. We don't have to take a chisel and demolish the person stone by stone in the person's life, because everything rests on this one foundation stone, which is the sense that there is a self here. And when that collapses, everything else collapses as well. The past and the future and meaning and morality and philosophy, and it all just collapses. So that's the pitch from here anyway, that's the suggestion from here, that that's what is the core of non-duality. It can't be described. Language breaks down. The same person in London who was having a go at me last week or the week before about nihilism was also having a go at me about using the word I. You know, personal pronoun. You know, I'm drinking this glass of water. Well, you know, how could you be saying that? You know, it's just language. We're really limping around with language trying to describe this, but a split second of seeing, and it's just known. It's still indescribable, but it's just known. Who's it known by? No one. What happens after that? Anything. No rules. Anything can happen, but then it's just known that there's no one living this life. Life, if you like, is happening, put it any way we like. Life is simply being lived, life is happening. The simplest way to put it is just, you know, I'm sure you've come across this phrase so many times before, all there is this, all there is what's happening. This is the totality of existence. Whatever is happening, whatever phenomena are happening, whatever experience is arising, well, that's it. That's it. I think I'll stop the introductory remarks there, and we'll see if there's anything else to be said.
What do you think of this analogy about duality? It is compared to mistaking a rope as a snake.
Yeah, it's great.
Is that like you see all of a sudden that is not a snake that I'm afraid of? There's no reason to be afraid of anything. It's just a rope. Is that similar to seeing there's no self?
I think it's absolutely great, but I think the thing that interests me about that analogy, and the really great thing about it, I think, is, you know, what it goes on to say. So there's a flash of lightning, and, you know, so you go into a room and you see this snake in the corner in the darkness. You go, oh, fear, which is probably how life is experienced by quite a few of us quite a lot of the time. Oh no, more life, please. I can't cope with that. And then there's a flash of lightning, and you suddenly see that what you thought was a snake is actually a rope. And so you go, everything calms down now. Oh, thank goodness, you know, for that. But for me, the real point about that, you know, the transformatory possibility in that could be a split second of lightning, is that as soon as the lightning's gone, the darkness is there again, and it looks like a snake again, but now it is known that it isn't. Okay. So the fear doesn't come back. So even to me, what's so wonderful about that little, whatever you want to call it, parable, analogy, whatever, is that just that split second of seeing and nothing else can totally transform, I want to say, our outlook on the world after that, but of course that's a nonsense phrase, but it can totally transform how the world is experienced after that. Even though the darkness descends again, the snake, the rope cannot be mistaken for a snake again.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of that other quotation from one of the Upanishads that I've quoted many times before, and I can't remember which show it's from. The lightning. I can't remember it exactly, but it's something like, the lightning strikes, the eye blinks, then you have either seen or you have not seen. If you have not seen, too bad. There's nothing you can do about it. So what?
Okay.
It's the same kind of thing. So it may only be a momentary flash, and it's interesting that the first real apprehension of non-duality is not always, but is quite often just this momentary flash. And it's like, okay, well, so what? It's a split second of seeing. Well, so what? Well, so what is that this can never be the same again. Even if the sense of self comes whizzing straight back after half a second or a second, this can never be the same, seen the same again. And I suppose because this is now becoming so much better known in the West now, you can talk to so many individuals who will confirm that. I mean, I do, because I'm just the position I've put myself in. I get communications with quite a lot of people, let's say, and again and again and again you can hear individuals talking in these terms. It's like life is never the same again. I mean, in a way, and I'm sure most, if not all of us in this room have heard this many times before, in a way, that split moment of second, that split moment of seeing, in that your life is ruined. It's like your life is over, your life is ruined. After that, you can forget about your life. And what happens after that? Well, this is freedom, so it's unpredictable. But yeah, that's a really good analogy. Yeah.
I was surprised when you said that is like also a perception, just a perception, this illusion of self.
We have to
like
use
anything.
words.
It's more than just a thought. It's more.
Oh, it's far more than a thought.
It's also a feeling. It's positioning.
Yeah, I use the word perception because that includes everything. All experience somehow includes perception. Yeah, it's much more than a thought. And it's quite possible that thought has never come into it, that never once in my life has there been the thought, I am a separate person, because I don't have a philosophical nature. I spent my life in the pub, throwing darts and drinking beer. So maybe there's never been the thought, I am a person, but that has nevertheless been the perception. And maybe I throw the dart, and perhaps in the time between the dart leaving my hand and arriving at the dartboard, maybe the self disappears. It's possible.
And that is a shift.
You could call it a shift of perception. I don't like that phrase because in a way it's too small. Because this is like, but language breaks down, so we might as well call it a shift. But just let's call it the most profound, deepest possible shift there can be. No, there's no shift like it. I mean, anybody in this room who, I'm sure, probably everybody in this room has experienced altered states of perception in some way or other. You've either kind of, had a terrible youth of drug taking, or, meditative experiences, or heavy psychological experiences, or all of them, or maybe all three at the same time, who knows, but probably everybody in this room has had altered perceptions, and this is so far in a different ballpark. Because in a way it's not about, it's not altered perception, when the senses, let's stick with this half second, split second, there's, we're not talking about altered perception. We're not talking about kind of hallucinogenic drug trip where the walls start to kind of go all wiggly and angels are floating in the air or anything like that. The perception may go on exactly as before. It probably will. What's different is there's no perceiver. So that sense that there is, duality, two things. We can name those two things in all sorts of ways, but for now let's call them experience and the experiencer. That's the normal perception. So what we're talking about is this shift where there is just experience with no experiencer. There's no reason why the perception of the experience itself should change. So if we say, I don't know if this is confusing to say it's the most profound shift in perception possible and no change takes place in perception. What is perceived remains, it doesn't have to. I'm sure there are awakenings which have hallucinogenic elements in them, but that's not usually what you hear described. Anything's possible. But we're not really talking about any change in perception. It's just that the perceiver disappears. And the assumption, it's just it's so deeply embedded in our consciousness and our language that it seems to be a nonsense to deny it. If there's perception, obviously there has to be a perceiver. It's kind of obvious, isn't it? Well, it is obvious until it isn't. It's obvious until the perceiver disappears. And then it's, it doesn't have to be a perceiver for perception to arise. Yeah. So there's just experience, there's just perception. The mind really doesn't like that. So the mind says, well, surely experience has to happen in something, and then maybe that something is called consciousness. We were playing with that idea last night for other reasons. There's this kind of sea called awareness or consciousness or something like that in which experience takes place. Well, no, that's just the mind trying to make sense of something it can't make sense of. There's experience. The one thing that's known is there's experience. Sometimes it's known that there's no experience as well. In deep sleep, for example, there's no experience, and sometimes that's known. Says the mind, who is it known by? If it's known, there must be a no. It's just known. There doesn't have to be a knower. Perhaps it's known by the mind of God then. Well, if we want that, have it. If we're unhappy with it's just words, it's just ideas, they don't matter. If we're unhappy with the idea that there doesn't have to be a knower for knowing to happen, there doesn't have to be an experiencer for experiencer to happen. If you like, when it all happens in the mind of God, have it. It's okay. We just invented an unnecessary component of reality, but then the mind's always doing that. So right, it doesn't matter. We won't have a holy war about it, hopefully. The non-dualists who believe in the mind of God and the non-dualists who don't, we don't have to go to war about it.
Well, the self can be interpreted that way as being God.
Yeah.
The all-encompassing self, the endless self, boundless self, everything is self.
Yeah, and that's God. Fine, have it if we want to have have God. It's a concept, and we want to have a definition. That's as good a definition of any. It's a lot better than a lot, isn't it? We're much less likely to get involved in holy wars with a definition of God like that. Fine, have it. I'm just sitting here saying, well, it's an unnecessary complication, but have it if we want. Minds like unnecessary complications. That must be one of the most obvious things about minds that don't exist. They like unnecessary complications. But it's actually really simple. There's just whatever. Finish that sentence in a number of ways. There's just whatever's happening. There's just whatever's being experienced. There doesn't have to be an experiencer for experience to happen. It's that bird song. That's it. That little movement of the hand there, that's it.